Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be starting now. My name is Eriq Vargas, and I am an alumni of the Kroc School of Peace Studies here at USD, and I am also the founder of the Palestine Solidarity Committee at USD as well. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are present on the unceded lands of the Kumeyaay people. Our presence here today is rooted in a generational injustice that we should all feel obligated to address, as it is only made possible due to theft, repression, enslavement, and cultural erasure, a history most relevant to the context of education, organizing, and advocacy efforts around Palestine. Being the son of an immigrant, I acknowledge that those of us who are immigrants or descendants of immigrants are fundamentally settlers on the lands of others. I believe it is a collective responsibility to seek ways of achieving justice for the people whose lands we occupy. On behalf of the Faculty and Student Organizing Coalition here at USD, I would like to welcome each and every one of you for this panel, and I am grateful for your desire to learn and to find a deeper understanding to one of the most important topics of the last several decades, and especially in the last 2 months. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to share that the next event that we are having is next Thursday, December 7th at 6 p.m., where another group of scholars will analyze the competing and overlapping visions of Zionism and the impact of those worldviews on the development and evolution of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. They will also examine if some branches of Zionism can offer potential solutions to the occupation. Today is day 58 of the genocide in Gaza and 7 days of a temporary ceasefire that, as of last night, officially ended after Israel says it is resuming combat against Hamas. More than 20,000 Palestinians in Gaza has been murdered, with over 40% of them being children, equaling over 8,000 children. What is needed at this point is a permanent ceasefire, the delivery of aid along with the end to the siege in Gaza, and then the end of the occupation. From there is where we will begin our conversation today. What can a political solution to this look like? What has it looked like for the past century? We will discuss the histories and the possibilities of a state-centered peace process in the form of a one-state, two-state, and even a no-state solution. Whether it be a desire to learn more about what has unfolded in the West Bank and Gaza after October 7th, or a desire that has lasted before the events of October 7th, I appreciate you, and I want to thank you for your time and also your respect given to our speakers. We will have a zero tolerance policy for anyone interrupting our speakers or disrespecting them in any way. So please keep any questions to the very end, where we will have an open Q&A session. Our first speaker is Ibrahim Marashi. He's an associate professor at the Middle East History at the California State University, San Marcos, and an advisory board member to the International Security and Conflict Resolution Program at SDSU. He obtained his doctorate in modern history at University of Oxford, completing a thesis on the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, part of which was plagiarized by the British government prior to the 2003 Iraq War, otherwise known as the Dodgy Dossier. He is co-author of Iraq's Armed Forces, an analytical history, the modern history of Iraq, and a concise history of the Middle East. His presentation today is titled British Imperialism and the Three-State Solution. Please join me in welcoming Ibrahim Marashi.
Hello, everyone, and greetings. I am going to share my presentation. The title is being a bit sarcastic and facetious. What do I mean by the three-state solution? In fact, I'll be talking about a couple of three-state solutions. But I wanted to start by giving a macro picture of how we got to the present and set up the next three speakers. And in honor of the fact that I was invited to give this lecture by a visual arts professor, I am going to try to do the impossible, sum up decades of British imperialism in several political cartoons from the time, and then visually try to communicate it with maps, And let us begin. Now, when I say I'm trying to give us a global picture of how we got to this situation, how did we get to the World War I alliance? Actually, when I had to find a political cartoon to begin with, to kind of give you a global history of how we got here, I chose this political cartoon, and the political cartoons I'm going to show you are in consecutive order, beginning in the 1890s. The British strategy of carving up lands was in here, of course, a global process. But what I found fascinating with the carving up of China is how the alliances on the eve of World War I came into being. Of course, if you recognize just from the semiotics of this political cartoon, hopefully you could guess who Queen Victoria is, and giving a very cruel look to the Germans, setting up the German-British rivalry on the eve of World War I. And notice Russia is looking, here we have the Tsar with France having Russia's back. So there we get the Russian-French alliance. But whether we talk about the Ottomans unable to prevent the carve-up of their empire, or China in this case, under the Qing dynasty, I'm trying to kind of highlight kind of a historical continuity. So I go from the process of carving up China to a very different process in Africa, where instead of carving up China into spheres of influence, Africa was more or less carved into colonies ruled directly. And of course, I want you to look at this political cartoon referring to the Rhodes Colossus. This is an image of Cecil Rhodes, the same Mr. Rhodes that endowed a scholarship at Oxford University, originally to train basically young white British scholars, young white British students to manage the empire in a variety of languages that they conquered. I want you to look from Cape Town, where one of Cecil Rhodes' boot is. Notice the telegraph wire and the other boot landing in Egypt, or in this political cartoon, Cairo, and just look again how Gaza is going to, very close to that boot. So, of course, here I show you a political cartoon now, bringing us to the carving up of Africa. And then now, and of course, the idea Cecil Rhodes was a proponent of a south-north axis, of course, united with telegraph wire. Of course, telegraph wires always were accompanied by railroad lines. Then I get to a kind of a British-French alliance, the agreement to carve up Africa. Britain would get its north-south access from Cairo to Cape Town. France was more or less given sway over West Africa. This was kind of an agreement. The eternal kind of Anglo-French rivalry is, in some extent, overcome in the carving up of Africa. And then finally, political cartoons provided by a French academic, and this graphic novel that I highly recommend. So when I say a three-state solution, it's a cartoon like this that gave me the inspiration of calling this a three-state solution. Three contradictory promises during the hostilities of World War I. In other words, now we have a British-French alliance, a French-Russian alliance, as well as a British-Russian alliance that are going to coalesce on the eve of World War I. I should say that let's look at the bubble right here, an Arab kingdom for Bedouin rebels manipulated by Colonel Lawrence. So in this political cartoon, let me give you a bit more of history. So this was an effort to prevent the Ottoman Empire from mobilizing a global call to arms amongst the Muslims in the British Empire, particularly India, think of Africa. A promise was made to the incumbent religious elite in Mecca, Sharif Hussein, as a way of kind of preventing a jihad being declared from the religious authorities and political authorities in Istanbul. A promise was made by the British authorities in Egypt that in exchange for siding with the British, a future Arab state, a future Arab kingdom, this is the first state, would be granted to the family of the Sharif of Mecca, Sharif Hussein. Just so you know, just according to the most recent history, that promise was written in very cagey diplomatic English that didn't translate very well into Arabic. Nonetheless, you had one group of people promised a state, an Arabian state that included the Arabian Peninsula, including the so-called Fertile Crescent, the Levant. At the same time, you had an agreement between between the parties of the alliance. Britain, France, and it's often forgotten, Russia as well had agreed to divide up the Ottoman Empire. We often forget the Russian agreement because the name of this secret agreement was known as Sykes-Picot. We forget the Russian part because, of course, the Russians defected from this agreement when the imperial government collapsed and the Bolsheviks actually released the secret agreement. So we now bestow it the name Sykes, representing the British side, Picot representing the French side. In this particular case, it's quite interesting. The French side signed the agreement in black ink. The British side, a kind of symbolism, might be apocrypha, signed it in pencil because even immediately upon signing it in pencil, the agreement to divide up the Ottoman Empire agreement couldn't be reached on the land around Jerusalem. The French had a history of claiming to protect the Middle East Christians population, particularly the Maronites in Lebanon. Remember the Crimean War involved religious claims of protecting Christians in the Middle East, also on behalf of Russia. Britain thought that a land bridge from the land around Jerusalem to the Gulf would be valuable, and hence why the British almost had an immediate desire to undo the agreement they signed, getting us to the next balloon. The Balfour Declaration was kind of a way to finally consider an almost esoteric idea at that time of recreating a Jewish state in the heart of the Middle East, particularly in the area around Jerusalem. 3 states. This is what I mean by the 3-state solution. The Anglo-French-Russian compromise would be this territory would be an international zone. Arabs had envisioned this land being theirs, and now a Zionist movement from the 1880s finally has a vision that they will be granted a state. Hence my argument that this is a 3-state solution. And then, of course, if we keep on going in our graphic novel, Woodrow Wilson was opposed to the secret agreement, but nonetheless, not because he felt any kind of need for self-determination for the Arabs, but that he did not want to be, this was the moment of America birthing multilateral liberalism in the form of the League of Nations. Wilson apparently, again, this is now conjecture, at the Paris Peace Conference couldn't forcibly argue against British and French interests of carving up the Ottoman Empire. This is apparently because he caught the pandemic, the COVID of its time. This would be not 2019, but 1919, the so-called Spanish flu, and had to leave Paris prematurely. Just a good way to show you basically the spoils. 2 mandates went to the French, Syria, and Lebanon, and then here we see the 3 mandates. Mandates, of course, the political unit bestowed upon the League of Nations, allowing Britain and France to hold on to the spoils of the Ottoman Empire. 3 states for the British, Palestine, Iraq, Transjordan, 2 for the French. And again, just as an homage to our host, if I recommend in terms of the visual arts, if I'm going to teach you the region of this, to teach you the history of this region through the moving image, I highly recommend This Land Is Mine, a political cartoon created by Nina Paley. But just very quickly now, if I just go through the maps, I know my time is over, but just let me show you the cartography behind this. Sorry, still a few more political cartoons. It's quite interesting if I zoom out and give a global history in terms of two-state solutions. Remember, just as a two-state solution was being proffered for the Palestine Mandate, I find it quite interesting literally around the same time a two-state solution again was being offered in another British domain, and that was India. And if you know the politics of South Asia, we're still witnessing tensions to this day from more or less the exhaustion of the British Empire, its slow collapse, and its desire to kind of now relinquish the parts of the empire. So, of course, Pakistan, India, and then later East Pakistan, otherwise Bangladesh. Um, I need to show you this map to explain the next one to set up. We could say a Russian-British alliance more or less came into being. An end to the great game is when Britain and Russia not only created a buffer state, not create, but allowed a buffer state to emerge in the nation that today we know as Afghanistan. But it's also forgotten they also carved up Iran into two spheres of influence. This was the 1907 convention, so that by 1914 now you have an Anglo-Russian alliance. But that zone of influence, of course, would later spread to Abadan due to its oil fields there. And this is the famous Sykes-Picot. Remember, this was one of the states, the promise of a state and international zone to appease the French. But remember, the British wanted control of the port of Haifa, and that would link up to here. If I zoomed out, Sharif Hussein's proposed state, and if I look at the greater Sykes-Picot Treaty, including what was supposed to be given to Russia, there we have it. I just want you to look at Britain's position by the end of World War I, again, just to situate the Palestine Mandate in a global history. Cecil Rhodes' dream came true. South Africa was united to Egypt. Germany lost Tanganyika. And if you ask any Tanzanian, there was a lot of, never mind. My dad's from Zanzibar. So there you see, there's my dad's story of Zanzibar. Anyway, from South Africa to Egypt, then you finally have now Egypt connected to the Palestine Mandate, Jordan, Iraq Mandate. And remember now, Iran, the south of it was under British, still a British sphere of influence. That now you not only have the Gulf all the way to the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, under British control. If we put that imaginary southern British sphere of influence in Iran, reaching India, then bringing us all the way through to Malaysia, Singapore, and then you almost have reached Australia. That's the story I wanted to more or less create before I sign off. And then where I leave off now, okay, is where I'm going to let the other speakers speak. But just to show you this kind of desire of partitioning, creating new states as solutions. This was something proposed back in 2006, how to make the Middle East a better region for American interests. And I finally leave off with a couple more maps of given to us by a Lebanese satirist referring to Sykes-Picot. A bit tongue-in-cheek, but referring to, again, one of the states as a solution. The same satire saying, if the Sykes-Picot solution was given to Europe, what would it have looked like? And finally, the US. And I leave there. And sorry for going a bit over. And thank you for allowing me to partake via Zoom.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marashi. Thank you. Our second speaker today is Dr. Ted Falk. Dr. Falk is an adjunct professor of Middle East history at USD. He obtained his doctorate from UCSD researching education and the formation of national identity among non-Muslims in the Ottoman Levant. There are spots remaining in his course next semester on film and historical memory in the Middle East, so make sure to register now if you're a USD student. His presentation today is titled Partitioning a People and the One-State Reality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Falk.
All right, thank you all for coming out on a Friday. For the third event I've done since this war began, and the first with John's enthusiastic support. So I wanted to start with the noted political philosopher Rick Pitino, coach of the Boston Celtics in the late 90s after the retirement of Larry Bird. So I'm here to tell you that Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Shimon Peres are not walking through that door. And if you expect them to walk through that door, they're going to be gray and old, and all three are coincidentally dead. And that is the current state of the two-state solution, which is why I think we have to confront the reality we're living in, the one-state reality. I'm not here to offer any solutions. I'm not here to say, oh, it should be one democratic state, it should be devolved cantons, what have you. But I am here to say that we can't turn back the clock to 1995. So I've used this in class before about building on Ibrahim's point, the kind of arbitrary ways we have divided not only the Middle East, but also big portions of Africa and Asia. And this kind of arbitrary design, whether by T.E. Lawrence or the not as quite celebrated colonialist Gertrude Bell, didn't really pay attention to the wishes of the people living there. So despite Woodrow Wilson's belief in self-determination in the rest of the world, although not in the southern United States, because he was a Klansman, this wasn't really applied in practice. And so we end up with colonialism by another name, the mandate system, a legal fiction, one of several legal fictions, I think, that are worth dissecting. So I think we face a situation where in both Israel, Palestine, or in the United States, or anywhere, we have to figure out a way to integrate, because the alternative is just not feasible in the long term if we want to maintain any kind of moral center. So I wanted to reference a Turkish-Armenian journalist who was assassinated for his courage in talking and confronting those uncomfortable things about history. That if we are going to live together, as he wanted Armenians and Turks to live together, we have to acknowledge that our ancestors weren't all saints. One thing he says is we are two sick nations, Turks and Armenians. Who will heal us? It won't be anybody else. We must heal each other. Let us understand each other. Let us respect each other's pain. He goes on to talk about, he lived in Turkey his whole life, and he talked about, I know Turks who deny the Armenian genocide, and they seem nice and kind people, so why would they deny the genocide? And his conclusion was that they know that genocide is bad, and they didn't want to believe that their ancestors were capable of doing such an act. So the image on the left was a satirical fractal snowflake solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict sent by a colleague. But that underlies the one-state reality, that there is only one government between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean that controls borders, that controls the flow of goods, that controls basically everything. And so the quote-unquote state of Palestine or Palestinian Authority only survives as an institution of the one state. And this has a parallel in the post-World War I era. A guy named P.A. Moss. This only exists because his father had a printing press, so he could publish pamphlets as he saw fit. And he saw the solution for European peace, a kind of Central European Union, as doing away with national boundaries in favor of these cantons that would go from the St. Stephen Cathedral in Vienna. He coincidentally was from Vienna, so he saw it as the center of the world. And he designed it so that every canton would have two nations. And he determined the nations of Europe to be Romans, that includes French and Italians, Germans, Slavs, and Magyars, or Hungarians. And so he said the only way we can avoid another catastrophic conflict like World War I is to canton ourselves with sharing these nations. How can we live together? It's through sharing this space. And I think there's a kind of interesting similarity in how he saw Europe being centered around Vienna. And during the Middle Ages, when Pope Urban II was calling for the crusade, he said Jerusalem is the navel of the world. It's the gate to all the continents. My wife says I have an Arab accent in Hebrew, so I won't attempt German. But his project is called the New Europe with a Lasting Peace. And he sees the conflict is coming from the center of Europe, and that's what needed reform. Is it stupid? Arguably, yes. Is it the fantasy of a early 20-something whose father owned a printing press? Also, yes. But I think what he recognized, and what I think we need to recognize right now, is that sometimes the status quo is a crazier scenario than even the wildest proposal. But I note that even in his hope for European peace, he did not see a place for Jews in his peaceful Europe, and instead he created the unfortunately named Hebrew Reich. So let's enter the realm of fantasy. And these all are plans with very little chance of success that usually involve war crimes. So during the early stages of the current war, there was pressure put on Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt to accept refugee flows from Gaza. But the Nakba was still on Palestinians' minds. So the idea of seeking shelter even temporarily in Egypt left them with the fear that if they left, they would not be allowed to return. And I think this goes along with a history of trying to create an alternate Palestine, an alternate Jerusalem. This is from a PR exercise in 2018 or 2019 saying, we see that now the West Bank has been annexed, and so Palestinians will live in this new state comprising the Gaza Strip and parts of the Sinai Peninsula. Sisi can't accept this for his own political sake in Egypt, but Palestinians wouldn't accept this either because it means a further removal from their ancestral homes. And during the quote-unquote deal of the century, during the Trump administration, they tried again to kind of create a legal fiction that they would create a Palestinian capital in Abu Dis, far east behind the wall. So saying, well, this is East Jerusalem, so that you can technically have a capital in East Jerusalem. But as I said in the earlier event that Ibrahim and Michael joined me at, even this kind of Swiss cheese solution wouldn't have been a real sovereign Palestinian state. And again, we have the creation of substitute Palestines. So instead of East Jerusalem or areas near Nablus and Jenin, they would get some empty bits of the Negev desert, which again has been proposed by various Israeli security sources as we need to get Palestinians out of Gaza so Hamas can be eliminated. Why not just send them to the desert? Which bears an eerie resemblance to Talat Pasha's comment on Armenians during the First World War when he was sending them to the Syrian desert. They can live in the desert, but nowhere else. And as I said in the previous event, Netanyahu has built his career on opposition to a two-state solution from his first term in 96 to 99, and then in the 2000s. And his political career is over when this war is over, and I think that's a principal reason why this war is continuing, is that he will lose his office and he will lose his immunity from prosecution as soon as he leaves the prime ministership. And the religious Zionist members of his cabinet, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, have basically told him during the truce period of hostage release and exchange that if he didn't restart the war after the exchange, they would withdraw from his cabinet. So effectively, this war is continuing for political purposes. And all the way back in 1978, Netanyahu, going by, I think because Yahoo sounds bad in English, went by Ben Natai when he was going to MIT. He appeared in a debate with Fuad Ajami on Boston Public Access, and essentially argued for this other expulsion, saying because the original mandates were only for Mesopotamia and Palestine, and then the Emirate of Transjordan was separated, that means Jordan is Palestine. And so you can just substitute one for the other. So in the 2010s, we get, let's substitute Northern Sinai for Palestine. In the 70s, they said, let's substitute Jordan for Palestine. In this debate from 1978, he said that West Bank Palestinians would have full human rights, full civil rights in Israel when it annexed what he called Judea and Samaria. That hasn't been the case. He says, nobody wants peace more than Israel, but the stumbling block on the road to peace is the demand for a PLO state, which will mean more war, more violence. Again, the PLO came to the table in the Oslo Accords, and that did not lead to a state. And he may have backing from the next prime minister of the Netherlands, known for bad hair and worse ideas. I'm running short on time, so I'll go through another couple. Condoleezza Rice proposed sending Palestinian refugees to Argentina and Chile, which I say that Jews and Palestinians kind of rhyme a little bit, because Herzl also proposed creating a Jewish state in Argentina, but he got outvoted in the early Zionist conferences. More recently, they said, rather than rebuild Gaza, let's build a floating airport and seaport. And now Israeli cabinet officials are saying, why don't we do away with Gaza entirely and just build a new artificial island like they have in Dubai, not neglecting the fact that those are environmental catastrophes and need to have their sewage taken out by truck because they are not actually connected to any infrastructure. They also don't realize that the Mediterranean is not the Persian Gulf. It has bigger tides because they planned a tourist attraction in Lebanon about 13, 14 years ago, and then they realized that they couldn't actually build it. So this is the realm of fantasy that we're living in. So I think we just have to accept that there is one government between the river and the sea, and it's just a matter of asking what kind of government should that be, what kind of judicial system should it have, and what that means for Israel's future and the future of the Palestinian people. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Falk. Our next speaker today is Dr. Michael Provence. He has taught modern Middle Eastern history at UCSD since 2004. He got his PhD in 2001, and Rashid Khalidi and Bashar Doumani were his dissertation advisors. He'll be speaking on the intentions, methods, and potential of a binational one-state solution. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. Okay. I think I'm gonna, maybe I'll say something about that one. What a pleasure to be here. And so I want especially to thank Eriq and John for inviting me and for organizing the panels that have taken place over this week. John gave me instructions, which I'm trying to follow, to talk about the one-state solution. I don't know how well we followed his instructions, but the presentations today, I think, are building on one another really in I think in an excellent way. So hopefully, when I'm finished, you won't think that I've kind of broken the streak, so to speak. So my topic is the one-state solution, or in history, and I want to do something a little unusual. I want to take a deep trip with you into the archives, which is not normally the way that we deal, professional historians deal with public talks like that, but that's what I want to do. And I want to take this trip into the archives to point out that the idea of a one-state solution, or one state in Palestine, or mandatory Palestine, is not a new idea. And despite claims or contentions that it might be an impossible idea, it's actually something that has existed for a period of almost 30 years in the early part of the 20th century. Now, it was a colonial state. Not a state of all its people, not a state of any citizens, actually. Colonialism is not a kind of a regime that bestows citizenship on people, but it was a single state between the river and the sea. A couple nights ago, there was a talk here on campus by our colleague Dr. Farid Abdelnour, of San Diego State, and a young man who I think is in the audience today asked a question which I thought was especially important and perceptive, and so I want to say something about that. Now, I think you can correct me if I paraphrase you incorrectly, because I think so, yeah. So he asked, and I'm paraphrasing, what we can say to people. Dr. Abdelnour offered an overarching survey of the history of the conflict over Palestine over the last 100 years. It was a masterful presentation of the entire range, and it's on film, and you can watch it if you weren't there. But the member of the audience asked a good question. What can we say to people who say that this history of expulsion, of dispossession, of oppression, and of violence against Palestinians is false? What can we say if they don't accept the historical narrative? Is that a reasonable paraphrase? Okay. Now, this is a very important question. And so what I want to talk about is the way that history is understood as a discipline, as a dialogue, as a debate over time. Okay? So we can understand that history is a series of interlocking dialogues. Dialogues between historians over the veracity of their interpretations. Dialogues between historians and their sources, the facts, the material that they gain from the archives. And that this process of dialogue and debate and discussion leads eventually to the emergence of a historical consensus about the facts of history and sometimes the meaning of history. Now, in the case of the presentation of Dr. Abdel-Nour, the facts and the presentation and the narrative are unimpeachable and are regarded collectively by responsible academic historians, whatever their ideological background, as being accurate. The meaning of those facts, of the expulsion of Palestinians, is not, there's not a consensus about that. So we can say that, for example, Benny Morris, who Dr. Abdel-Nour mentioned, would say, yes, the Palestinians were expelled, made to flee in 1948. Yes, they became refugees, but no, it wasn't a crime. It was a proper outcome. Now, that's a matter of debate and opinion, but the facts are not in dispute, okay? And it's because of that process of dialogue that the facts of history, what has happened, is not in dispute, okay? Now, it's also sometimes the case that the public becomes interested or engaged in historical debates, and particularly the situation in Palestine, the conflict over Palestine is one of these cases. But historians don't argue to win debates. They argue to enhance their scholarly reputations, to advance their interpretations. So when we are arguing simply to win a debate at any cost, that's not going to enhance anyone's scholarly reputation. So that's not actually part of the dialogue of history, if you can see the distinction. And so recently a mainstream Israeli, or I should say a mainstream defense of Israeli policy and actions in the recent past has been to say that to call Israel a colonial state or a settler colony is to deny the Jewish people the biblical right and justification for the Jewish state, and is thus on its face to make this argument that there is a colonial genealogy to Israel, to the conflict, to the situation in the Middle East generally, but particularly in Palestine, is anti-Semitic. And this argument is made. And this gets back to the question of the veracity of the facts and the history and the dialogue. Okay? So these are arguments that are meant to silence criticism. So when someone says that to discuss the colonial genealogy of Israel is to engage in anti-Semitism, this is an argument intended to win an argument, not advance a historical dialogue, if you see what I mean. It's intended precisely to silence the possibility of criticism or meaningful engagement with history. And those are not historical arguments. They're ideological, political arguments. Okay? And so we can say a few things about this, obviously. I mean, as far as the argument that there is no, that Israel is not a colonial state, or that there is no colonial genealogy to the state, this is false on the face of it, and I'm going to go into that in a minute. And that the justification for the existence of this state is based on the Bible is also not a historical argument. The Bible is a holy book. There are other holy books. All of the monotheistic religions have holy books. They are not historical sources. They may be sources for religion, sources for faith, but they are not sources of history. Okay? The nationalist narratives of any given national movement are ideological and political arguments, not historical arguments. Some examples. The modern Iranians are not the people of King Cyrus. The Germans are not Roman barbarians. The Egyptians are not the people of the pharaohs today. The Lebanese Christians are not Phoenicians. The modern Greeks are not citizens of Pericles' Athens. The Turks are not Hittites. The Palestinians are not Canaanites. And the Israeli citizens, the Jewish Israeli citizens of Israel, are not Israelites. Those are something, we're talking about modern history. And there are no straight, unbroken lines from that past to this present. None. All of our ancestors, all of them, have mixed, married, fought, migrated, lived, and died for far too long for there to be any grain of truth to any of these nationalist myths based on these ancient myths and stories from holy books. Okay? So we're left with the modern history of the present. Full stop. The last 100 years, the conflict over Palestine. And so that's where I go back to John's request, the history of one state. So this is a map. This is the Sykes-Picot Accord map. This is the actual map. It's an image of the actual map. And if you look at right here, you'll see that's Mark Sykes and that's François-Georges Picot, two signatories of the map that partitioned the Middle East as a colonial project of Britain and France in 1916. In 1917, the British government decided that they didn't like the map because their situation was better. And so they needed a new arrangement to achieve British colonial goals right here. And this was the document to do that. Okay? This is the Balfour Declaration, the actual letter of the Secretary of the Foreign Secretary Balfour. Okay? Now, Britain occupied the Arab East in 1918, made pledges to France. I'm worried about time. I guess I need to speed things up. And instituted a colonial dispensation in Palestine in 1918. Okay? And so, as I said a minute ago, between 1920 and 1948, it was one single state. But it was necessary because of the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson. This section down here is relevant, but I'm going to skip past it quickly. And the League of Nations Charter, that this new colonial state, and all of the colonial states in the Middle East, and this is directly from the archives in Geneva. This is a sketch map of the time, of the casualness of the arrangements. All of these states had to be somehow Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan. All of these mandates, these League of Nations mandates, had to be given the notion or the appearance of something that Woodrow Wilson had promised the world when he entered the war, which was consent of the governed and self-determination. So they needed a kind of a facade of representation, and that was the charter of the League of Nations. The wishes of these communities must be the principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory. There was a problem. The mandatory charters were written without reference to the populations of the countries involved, except for in the case of Palestine, where the Palestinian mandate, the mandate for the Palestine mandate, was written with an actual clause of representation for the Zionist agency. It was the only political configuration mentioned in the mandate charters. So when the British government went to Palestine under the first High Commissioner, all of these countries, Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, Palestine, all of them had colonial High Commissioners. All of them had colonial codes of law. But because of the mandate and its fake idealistic language, they also needed constitutions. And so the British government went to the High Commissioner, a British statesman and Zionist named Herbert Samuel. And Samuel said, okay, we're going to set up a constitutional arrangement. And we're going to, and he asked the Zionist agency, what do you want? And they said, parity. And he said, well, what do you mean parity? And he said, 1-to-1. And he said, not unreasonably, but you're only 15% of the population. And so Samuel said, okay, we'll do this. We'll set up a constitutional assembly in Palestine with 8 Muslims, 2 Christians, and 2 Jews. And that'll be the representation. Those people will be elected, and then we'll have 12 appointed British colonial officials. And this was the first constitution for the Palestine Mandate. Okay? Now, the Palestinian population said, wait a minute, we were entitled and promised self-representation. We reject this because this is not majority rule and it's not self-representation. And they began to send, this is a telegram from the archives in 1922. You can see May 1922. You can read it. I don't need to read it to you. And this is how they responded. The Zionist population said, okay, we accept this. The Palestinian population said, we reject it because it's unfair and we do not accept the mandate or the Balfour Declaration. Okay? Now, a couple of years later, the Palestinian population, led by a person named Musa Kazem al-Husseini and his nephew, a man named Jamal al-Husseini, who was a graduate of the Syrian Protestant College, later to become the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, in Beirut, wrote a series of petitions like this. And he made several points. And it says I'm up to time, so I'm going to wind things up here. He said, the Palestine Mandate was overwhelmingly inhabited by a Muslim and Christian Arab majority, that they could trace their ancestry back a very long time, centuries. The population had lived under the authority of the Ottoman state and for 4 centuries with a high degree of local autonomy and harmony and total freedom of faith, practice, and education. The inhabitants of all races and religious beliefs participated on a base of equality in the election of local officials and representatives. Now, in 1924, Jamal al-Husseini had decided, and the leaders of the Palestinian community in Palestine had decided, that in fact they did want to participate. And they accepted the idea of some sort of proportional representation in an elected body. And so Jamal al-Husseini wrote another petition and an argument, and he said, we demand the establishment, this is in 1924, we demand the establishment in Palestine of a national constitutional government in which the 2 communities, Arab and Jewish, will be represented in proportions to their numbers as they existed before the application of the Zionist policy. 1 state, 1 nation, between the rivers, with equal representation for every citizen. 99 years ago this year. Okay? So this is not a new idea. It's an old idea. Of course, by that time, the Zionist movement was sufficiently strong that they rejected this proposal. And the Palestinians were rendered, for the duration of the mandate, not represented. In the 1930s, Jamal al-Husseini he never did anything but write petitions. He was sentenced to death by the mandate authorities and exiled to the Seychelles during the course of the 1930s and into the 1940s. And he was never allowed or permitted to take his position as a legitimate leader of the Palestinian community. So we can ask, and I'm going to conclude, to say, how do colonial arrangements change? And the answer is not by voluntary action. They change when they have to change. Colonial governments, settler colonies, abandon their domineering position, their minority rule, their unjust practices when they have no choice. And I think that in our lifetimes, we will see that time come. We will see that time when the situation, the injustice that is embodied in the colonial structures and legacy of mandatory Palestine and Israel will come to be seen by everyone as unsustainable, impossible, and intolerable. And I think that time will come. But we can't deny the colonial genealogy of the state in the present, in the recent past, in the more distant past, and the fact that colonial arrangements are not permanent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Provence. Our last speaker is Dr. Rico Monge. He is an associate professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego. His doctorate is in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his research and teaching specializes in comparative Christianity and Islam, theory of religion, and continental philosophy, including political philosophy. He's also an ordained deacon in the Eastern Orthodox Church, who in this capacity has worked extensively in Palestinian American Christian communities and has participated in numerous Jewish Christian dialogues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rico Monge.
Thank you all. Hopefully this goes well. I'm going to try and do my best to edit this video that I'll be showing quite a bit of here, although now we're having an issue.
In 2012, when
All right, let's try this again. All right, there we go. So actually, I couldn't agree more with Michael that I think the flow of this panel just really organically goes from one thing to the next. And I hope that what I have to present today makes a nice kind of capstone to it and a way of facilitating fruitful discussion. So, of course, on the face of it, talking about a no-state solution or talking about anarchism to most people because of how much we are locked into that colonial notion of the modern nation state, which has been exported and basically imposed upon the whole world. It's hard for us to imagine any other alternatives to how human beings can organize themselves. The documentary I'm about to show a few bits of are by a man named Carn Ross, who was a British diplomat who actually was an advocate for Iraq War I under Bush Classic, as I sometimes call him. But then really had a deep reckoning with what he had advocated for back in the early 1990s, and reached a breaking point after 9/11, interestingly enough, connecting us back to Ibrahim and his comments on Ibrahim's work that was plagiarized for the Dodgy dossier, which legitimated the invasion of Iraq for UK politicians. that dossier was contradicted by respected British weapons inspector David Kelly, who then was grilled before Parliament for contradicting official British statements on weapons of mass destruction. And David Kelly then, at least the official record is that he committed suicide after his bullying, although that is debated, and there are a number of articles you could look up on whether or not he was actually murdered, according to conflicting coroner reports. But at that point, Carn-Ross came to an existential crisis of no longer being able to believe in modern liberal nation states and their democratic promises. And he started searching for what could he actually believe in again. And it was at this point that he came across what he talks about as complexity theory, which is the idea that the world is irreducibly complex. It is not, which is different than complicated. In other words, complicated is your car. Complicated is calculus. Those things that are complicated are difficult to understand, but they are fully knowable. Okay? You can actually come to a place where with enough study, you can know how a car works. You can come to a place with enough study where you understand how calculus works. The world, on the other hand, is not complicated. The world is complex, meaning it cannot ever be reduced to any sort of full understanding. And part of the problem is that when we try to think of solutions to issues, we think that we can figure out the complicated nature of the world, and then impose a particular way of doing things on the world. Okay? Which is what leads to, by the way, there's a slogan, you come by my office door, you'll see it on my door, but that hierarchy is what creates chaos. Anarchism is solidarity with all oppressed peoples. And the idea that hierarchy creates chaos is the idea that because you take a complex world and then try to fit it into some sort of box or system, and you will always end up with people that do not fit into that system, with cultures and lives and so forth that do not fit into that system. And then what happens typically is horrifying atrocities. After that, Carn-Ross went and had meetings with the most probably esteemed anarchist intellectual today, although he is probably on his way out from this world in the next few weeks, perhaps, or months, Noam Chomsky. He then did a lot of time reading George Orwell and Orwell's Homage to Catalonia and the way in which anarchist principles were put into practice in Catalonia. The Catalan parliament retains very anarchistic vibes to this very day, and have been persecuted by it by the rest of the government of Spain. But Orwell was very taken. If you've ever read 1984 or Animal Farm and found Orwell fascinating, I highly recommend reading Homage to Catalonia, in which he talks about his just kind of being blown away by the kind of egalitarianism of that world until Joseph Stalin aligned with the fascists that became eventually Franco's dictatorship and helping crush the anarchists in Catalonia in order to keep the idea that only a totalitarian communist state is the answer. From then on, Carn-Ross went to a town in Spain called Maranello, in which people have put this into practice through a series of general strikes. They were able to take over the town totally non-violently. They run the factory there in a completely collective and egalitarian way. Lo and behold, you don't actually need a boss to make a business run. anarchism, by the way, if you want a slogan for it, it's democratize everything. If you actually believe in democracy, democratize everything. Okay? But in any case, from there, he goes on to the writings of Murray Bookchin, who then became deeply influential on a Kurdish movement, which I am now about to play a little bit of his documentary on them, because he wanted to go see an area of the world in which it was being put into practice. Okay. The last thing that I'll say about Murray Bookchin's style of branch of anarchism is often known as democratic confederalism. And a hallmark of democratic confederalism that I think is important to thinking about this idea of complexity versus the complicated, of complexity versus imposed solutions, is that in complexity, I mean, in this kind of democracy I'm talking about, it is not the democracy, the sort of what I would just blatantly call false democracy that we are used to, in which 51% gets to cram down the 49% throat. Haha, we won by a tiny amount, and so therefore we rule. Okay? Rather, it's consensus-based democracy. Often certain models can vary, but the idea is that you try to reach an 80 to 90% consensus before something actually becomes a rule. Now, that sounds insane, right? To try and get Senate or the House of Representatives to reach a 90% consent. But if it were actually the rule, what does that do? It forces people to talk to each other. It forces people to listen to each other. It forces people to actually respect each other's opinions and come to a consensus. It's not always going to be pretty and utopian and idealistic, but it helps address some of these issues of complexity. All right. So anyway, I'm going to show now Karen Ross's trip to Rojava. Karen Ross, a little other tidbit about him. He actually became the inspiration for a character in a John le Carré novel. But anyway, let's see some of his travels. Due to time, I'm going to have to jump around a little bit. Hopefully it will still be coherent.
Large parts of the Assad regime collapsed in Syria. Can the principles of anarchism, no hierarchy, decisions made by the people, no state? Really be operating here?
ورجيم جي قالك دولتك بتخوازن دز درجي ناو سوري بكن وقرا براها بكن يعني شرك نافقي طائفي مذهبي ودر خنكش جبويكي سياستك وما بين جاري دا مشان تربجي قدرت يعني هري مالتانيت السوري دا شري طائفي بيش نكتيا شري نافقي بيش نكتيا هري مملا وهري مما برنجي يعني عرب هيا مسيحي هيا كرد هيا جيكو هركز دكاري بو تدخي مشكلة درخي بتكوشينا ما السياسي نريد بشغل مشكلة قرد عم يروم هذا القرار.
This is a communal assembly where the villagers meet to decide their local affairs.
نعم سياسة تختور بيجنا مدارتين من القيد قبل بما حرقان الزكاة الحمد لله ده من كل كيف وصعاب كريا والله آخر نبت ذبا حراقة هذا الألف حراقة والمحمود كافناتن بيت عديلات الجسم شيء من سربا حراقة بيدوي.
All the villagers take part, men and women, there are Arabs and Assyrians, and they're allowed to speak first to make sure that non-Kurdish minorities are given a voice. Men and women sit separately, a practice that is part of Kurdish society. but women have a strong voice in the discussions.
So this is self-government in action, and here is the level that matters in Rojava. Decisions for here are taken for here, decisions that affect here as much as possible are made here. And if decisions need to go to a higher level, then they'll go up to the next level of the legislative assembly. But as far as possible, decisions about things that matter here are made in that room right there.
Decisions that can't be made locally are made here at the regional assembly. After watching the debate, I met some of the representatives.
ينضم المجلس التشريعي لجميع المكونات مع قانون واحد. من اساس المجلس التشريعي تمثيل المراه هي 40%. هذا موجود في المجلس التشريعي. طبعا مع جميع المكونات العرب والسوريان والاتراك والتركمان والارمن.
يعني بس يما أزبيشنا بس عرب ليبري بس فلادين كعرب مش شكل تجاه مقاليد يعني بس فلادين كرد سبيان وبيرد يعني يمكن يرد.
Do you feel as a young person that your ideas are taken seriously in the assembly?
First time it was hard on us.
Yeah.
Because it was the first time that we had this young age in the parliament.
Yeah.
And everybody was new country. Especially as young women, they see our ideas, they see how we work in the parliament, they take our ideas seriously and they believe it. Here we are trying to build a system going forward to take ideas from us.
I've been in a lot of crappy chambers where you see people sitting like this Security Council, Parliament, blah, blah, blah. This one, although it's a bit shabby, it's kind of the best. And you could almost make a kind of inverse paradigm that the shabbier the collective chamber, the better the democracy. The more ornate and gilded, the more jaded the democracy, the less representative. Some age-old local practices of reconciliation fit well with anarchist philosophy in Rojava, and it doesn't involve the state. Where we're heading is to a reconciliation lunch between two families. This is an example of the way that the justice system here works, because rather than going to court, these two families have been encouraged to have consultations and negotiations between each other. The reason for this event was that a man had been accidentally shot and killed. Both families have already come together to settle the matter and agree compensation. Now the perpetrator's family is hosting a meal to show that they're sorry. There's an obvious tension here between the established culture and more egalitarian political ideals. The women are nowhere to be seen.
Is what's happened here satisfactory for the family? There's a real sense of having arrived somewhere that's very special for me. Oops. It's like, you know, for anarchists, this is like Republican Spain during the Civil War. This is our Ithaca.
Anarchism in Spain was crushed by Stalin. Today in Rojava, it faces another deadly threat.
I just skipped over it there where he's showing the non-hierarchical organization of their militias and how they were key in the defeat of ISIS, but I figured we could cut that out for now.
These people have built democracy, they have built the largest area of Syria that is stable and democratic. It's an inclusive democracy where Assyrians, Arabs and Kurds alike are given a fair crack of the whip. You know, what's not to support? They are fighting ISIS. They are sacrificing hundreds of lives. They are the people fighting the world's war against this horror. The problem is nobody's listening to them. And countries even like America, which is at war here, is not talking to them at a political level. The military have contacts with the YPG, but at a political level they're not talking, and that's a hell of a battle, and it's a battle, you know, I'm glad to take on. I have rarely felt more solidarity with a cause than I feel with these people here. It sounds romantic, you know, I'm not Lawrence of Arabia, I'm just a guy in an NGO struggling, doing what I know how to do, but this is what I'd like to do. This is for me why I do what I do. And I am really, 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 I'm really sad to leave, really sad. Donald Trump, a racist and a misogynist and a billionaire, is the centre of political attention. So the bile rises, and we think we're better than them. You know, we think we have a superior system. I'm like, who's the idiot here?
The basic claim of government is to provide order, but the evidence suggests growing disorder. And as they lose control, the response of governments will be more intrusion and more coercion. This is the future, unless we act. The opposite of government-imposed order is not chaos. There's a deeper order, concealed within human society. which relies not upon coercion, but cooperation and trust. Built not by governments or politicians, but by people who realise at last their own true power. There is no hierarchy. But this won't happen on its own. It's up to us.
As he said, he doesn't want to be overly romantic, and indeed there are, in 12 years of war, there are difficulties and imperfections, and you could even see in issues of struggle with culture, they're still working on some of the values of, say, feminism versus certain patriarchal structures there and so forth. But the main question I want to leave us with here at the end is this a pipe dream? It's very easy to just dismiss it as a pipe dream, and there's a lot of good reasons to, right? I mean, one right now would be that if we tried to apply or take lessons from this model, like the young Kurdish woman talked about in the clips I showed, it's hard to see where to go with the statistics right now in Israeli society of anti-Arab racism sentiment and how high it is, and how high the levels of anti-Semitic sentiment in the West Bank and Gaza currently are. And the ways in which that got there are basically have been elaborated by the prior speakers, that the kind of colonialism and divvying of things up have pitted these groups against each other to the point where hatred keeps rising. Another reason for pessimism is the geopolitical interests. It's been going viral recently. Joe Biden's statement back, I believe in the 80s, where if there were no Israel, America would have to invent an Israel to protect its interests in the region. These sorts of things are obviously massive obstacles to the realization of any sort of alternative to the modern nation state. But I want to leave us with three things to think about here. One, I would say, is the problem of the nation state itself, and I subscribe fully to this, as Max Weber put it, that the definition of the state is that it is the entity which wields legitimate violence within a given territory. And it's that legitimate violence at the essence of a state that when mixed, so first of all, what a state is going to do, a state is going to do violence. Okay? And feel free to ask me more about that in Q&A if you want. But coming from a religious studies background, I'm going to make a rather bold, but I think easy to defend claim that when people point out, especially say hostile atheists like Richard Dawkins, they say, oh, Christianity, Islam, the two most violent religions in the history of the world, they're the problem. I would say that, yes, revolutionary monotheisms have occupational hazards. Revolutionary monotheism, meaning Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the idea of my God is the only God and your gods are all wrong, carry with it inherently exclusionary dangers or occupational hazards. But you take those dangers and occupational hazards and you mix them with state power and you get mass death. Okay. That's my response to Richard Dawkins. Okay. The issue is putting these two things together. And currently what we are now seeing is yet the third revolutionary monotheism now having a nation-state superpower capability, and we're seeing mass death. And this is why I don't have much hope for a two-state solution, because then you would just have two states with monopolies on legitimate violence pitted against each other, and I believe the thing would still continue. Okay. I also don't think it's a pipe dream because I believe most of the anarchist thinkers, I don't believe this, most of the anarchist thinkers, Murray Bookchin, Noam Chomsky, who I just mentioned, are Jewish. Within anarchist thought, Jewish thinkers are dominant. Anarchist kibbutzes are all throughout, and I know that's the wrong plural in Hebrew, okay? But they're all throughout Israel. Mohammed Abdud has just published a great study on Islam and anarchism. Okay? That these ideas can't be helped to grow and foster is not completely a pipe dream. And I'll end then with my hat is actually a Zapatista hat, not a Fidel Castro hat. Okay? And the Zapatistas are a similar group, if you're not familiar with them, that in many ways arguably laid the path and paved the way for what is happening in Rojava. The Zapatistas started out as 6 people in 1983 having meetings together. 6 people. Eventually, they grew to the point where a professor of philosophy at a major university in Mexico decided to join them, not to lead them, but to help organize them and to help them figure out how to achieve their autonomy. And yes, they had to take up arms at first against the Mexican government in order to get it, but they have spread from 5 towns to now 2/3 of Chiapas, not through military expansion, but through people looking at their way of life and saying, this is a better way, we want to buy in. I don't think it's a pipe dream. I honestly think we have to move past this idea of the modern nation state. And I don't think it's just Israelis and Palestinians whose lives depend on this. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists at the beginning of this year said we are at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest we have ever been, further than any point during the Cold War. And that was before this conflict flared up again. As Karn Ross says, it's up to us. The future of humanity depends on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monge. So now we're going to open up the Q&A session. If I could have our speakers join me at the table here. If we could just give one more round of applause for our speakers. Thank you all so much for your fantastic presentations. Now, before I open up to the audience, I just want to ask you all one question. It should be a fast question, but not necessarily simple. If you can summarize in either one word or a few words what you view as the biggest obstacle to your presented on solutions, what would that word or several words be? And whoever wants to go first can go to answer that.
The scars of history.
Also, sorry, let's just get the mics on.
I would say the scars of history, that the idea of choosing to live together is one I believe in, but it's hard to overcome the past trauma.
Sure. Oh, okay. I was trying to demur. Well, I can't add anything to what Ted has said, but of course, the position of the United States. The position of the United States.
I don't disagree with either of those. I'd rather just kind of say I'm building off of them. I agree with Ted, and I kind of referenced it. The generational trauma is a massive obstacle. As I also said, the geopolitical interests of the United States and its hyperpower status. But I would add to that kind of what was in my talk, the title of my talk, the failure of the liberal imagination. That we are stuck in a place where we cannot, we believe this is the end of history. This is as good as it gets. There's nothing for humanity to evolve into further. There's nothing to learn from the way indigenous classless societies in the past have operated, et cetera, et cetera.
And Dr. Marashi, thank you for staying with us. If you would like to also answer that question.
Can you repeat the question?
If you can summarize in one word or a few words the biggest obstacle to the solution that you had presented on today.
Well, so if I was presenting on the past, British imperial hubris.
Okay.
That was the obstacle that I think we're still living, that we're still living in the shadow of.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. So now I will open it up to the audience. I will be bringing the microphone to you.
Hi, this is a question for Dr. Falk. And first, I want to say, Dr. Provence, is that your name correctly? Okay, I want to say thank you for paraphrasing my question from last meeting. I too agree with the sentiment that we are going to be seeing in our lifetime the peace and the resolve of the problem in the area. So my question for Dr. Falk is, earlier in your presentation, you had mentioned that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be seeing the end of his political career. Is that because of the political turmoil that was occurring earlier this year, or is this because of the actions during this quote-unquote war?
I think it's the military lack of preparedness. I think he could have eked out a narrower and narrower coalition with the more extremist parties. But I think the military, the Israeli military failures, and there are some Israeli analysts who speculated that this isn't independent of the settlements in the West Bank. That a lot of Israeli troops were actually deployed during the Jewish holiday to protect settlements, and they weren't expecting anything from Gaza. So I think the lack of military, the intelligence failures, is what will mean the end of his political career.
Excellent. Okay, follow-up question, if I may. Yeah, so the government reform that we saw earlier this year, is that something that could attribute to the, incompetence that we saw from October 7th?
I mean, Netanyahu he tweeted that and then deleted it, blaming the Israeli reservists protesting by saying they wouldn't do their reserve military service, but he got enough pushback that he deleted that tweet. I don't think that actually affected things as much as he might want them to seem that way.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it.
Should the United States go to the United Nations, declare recognition of an independent Palestinian state with borders in Palestine, and ask for a UN peace mandate, U.S.-led NATO forces, boots on the ground, to maintain peace in all of Palestine in coordination with Israel, and to have the city of Jerusalem made an international city because of the confluence of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. All your thoughts.
It's an interesting question. A minute ago, Eriq asked us if what the biggest obstacle to a solution, so to speak, might be. And it occurred to me after he asked the question, you know, it always takes a minute to kind of think about something, that every partition plan, and by that I mean 1937, 1947, the two-state solution, every so-called partition plan emanated from outside the region and the people most directly concerned. And so I think that John's conception in organizing this panel on the one-state solution, the binational state, is actually, you know, really very perceptive. And I think that maybe the biggest obstacle to a solution is the notion that there can be a way forward by separation, partition, and living apart as opposed to learning to live together. We have here a scholar of the Greek and Turkish separation of 1923, 100 years ago this year, Dr. Aytek Alpan, who spoke yesterday about the miseries and trauma that the Greek-Turkish population separation exchange of 100 years ago led to over time. And so I think that actually maybe the two-state solution, the partition of Palestine, is something that everybody ought to disabuse themselves is a solution to anything, whether with U.S. power or without it. But I mean, others will have different. Still, it's a bold proposal.
I mean, I think there were some West Wing episodes in the early 2000s fantasizing about an American peacekeeping force, but I think I don't think anything led by NATO or the United States will have credibility for Palestinians. So perhaps some sort, if there were a two-state solution, a non-Israeli military force, but I don't think America has the credibility to be part of that.
Thank you.
And I know President Erdogan of Turkey would very much like to be a part of that boots on the ground solution.
You know, the conflict over Palestine is so deeply embedded in the United Nations from the moment of birth, actually. And every border, with the exception of Sinai, has been patrolled by UN peacekeeping troops for scores of years. And hundreds of UN peacekeeping troops have been killed by the Israeli military. And a lot of people don't realize this. Of course, the social services of Palestinian refugees have been provided for by the United Nations since 1948, and all of this is so the UN is, I mean, it's absolutely central on every level. So I think, you know, more that type of internationalism is maybe not a good prescription, but I think it's worthwhile to know, for people to realize how deeply engaged the United Nations is on every level of the conflict, and also how deeply contemptuous the Israeli government has been of the United Nations for decades. Well, really since the first UN resolutions. So, you know, those are just facts.
I have a comment question. I might be taking this out of context, so feel free to correct me, but one of the statements said towards the very end as we were getting started with this, was that this is the end of existence. There's nothing left to learn. There's nothing left to learn from indigenous societies. And I beg to differ. As we're talking through this, and this is the second panel, in no way, form, or fashion do we say, like, this is it, right? But we're all still very much discussing options of resistance and living with the impacts of war. To this group here, to our community, that's probably more updated than I would be. Is there any public or known intelligence to reflect that there has been a call to sovereign tribal nations to be in discussion, to be in community, to talk more about a way forward? I ask this because Native and Indigenous nations have long histories of living in reciprocity with the land that included other nations crossing, encroaching, seeking asylum in their own nations as they lived. And during this time when there was to be war or to be a fight, a battle, there were rules of engagement that included their leadership sitting before a pending war between tribes to learn more about each other, to build transparency for the why they were either encroaching, crossing, seeking asylum, and to agree to those terms. Some of that conversation included understanding their population size, their identity, their culture, their assets as to who they were, and then to determine when they would lay down their respective hands in battle to consent to those agreements before. And that's only to say that if a tribe or a nation or a population had less people, or we're flailing in identity, or, you know, all the reasons why those two sat down and discussed who they were before they went to war. Was it 50 people that one nation was willing to lose? Was it 20? And when people were keeping count of that, respectfully getting to that number, rather than decimating each other, respecting those identities, that they would come together at some point, because that was the term. They would embrace that, right? Lay it down and come sit down and talk about it. So I don't think people have lost those ways. We just don't respect them anymore to even ask. So I'm asking, are we aware that whether it's Palestine or other ways of thinking, have they called on sovereign tribal nations to sit down and seek other options or other thoughts for the way forward?
So first, before I respond more, did you mishear me as saying that I was saying there was nothing more to learn, or?
You're welcome to correct me. I said that at the beginning.
Okay, no, it's like, because I apologize then. No, I was saying the exact opposite. I am criticizing the American mentality that goes with a certain type of European philosophy that believes we will reach what is called the end of history, meaning we have now progressed to the point where we are beyond everybody else, and there's nothing else to progress to. And so what I was actually saying is we have the arrogant attitude that there's nothing to learn, there's nothing to envision forward, and there's nothing to learn from past societies, like indigenous societies, like the Lakota Sioux, like so many others that were exactly as you were describing. In other words, I'm sure you're probably familiar with Nick Estes and the Red Nation movement and so forth. These are groups that have strong solidarity with Palestine and so forth, but you know, their kind of refrain is communism is our past, communism is our future, because their point is, you know, just in case people don't understand, non-authoritarian communism is anarchism. Like they're basically, to simplify here, they're the same thing. And so in that regard, like even Marx also referred to, indigenous classless societies as communist, like, so in this sense, and with that sort of reciprocity and communality and so forth. So in that sense, I think, like, for example, like I said, the Zapatistas are, they do draw, like, from the indigenous movements, from their indigenous past and values. They've combined that with both Marx and with anarchism and with a lot of other things to create this sort of, like, reciprocity that was in the video. So, as to whether or not these groups are being consulted enough or consulted at all beyond the idea that the influence the Zapatistas are having, I honestly don't know, and that would be an interesting question. But did I at least clear up that I was actually saying the opposite? Yeah.
I was wondering about I'm seeing on Instagram now where there's people are saying that Israel knew Hamas's attack plan more than a year ago, and a blueprint reviewed by the Times laid out the attack in detail. Israeli officials dismissed the aspirational. They dismissed the aspirational and ignored specific warnings. So people are saying that, that they did this on purpose because they wanted to do what they're doing. And they knew this would open up an opportunity. There's a couple of posts about it, so I just wanted to know if any of you want to comment on that, or that's all. Thanks.
We got a similar question at our previous event, and my pithy response is that Bush didn't have to do 9/11 to know how to exploit it after the fact. And I believe, Michael, you said something to the effect of, you can have all of the intelligence in the world, there is that hubris, and the belief that they couldn't pull something like this off on October 7th. I think it would, yeah, they can have all the intelligence in the world, but military intelligence is a contradiction in terms.
Yeah, along the lines of what Ted was saying, I teach in my classes like Bin Laden's letter to the U.S. and the reasons he gave for attacking us, which incidentally, I don't know if you've seen the news, but just went viral on TikTok, and then The Guardian finally took it down after 20 years, which I think is kind of criminal in its own right. But I think, yeah, I completely agree with Ted there that, Naomi Klein, for example, has talked about this sort of thing of like disaster capitalism or shock politics, that you don't even have to know in advance in order to actually have it be prepared in advance to exploit when the inevitable will occur, right? That said, the real answer to your question will be something that maybe we know 20 years from now or never, right? Like there are tons of things we know now that come out when they get declassified, et cetera, that we would have thought unthinkable. But I think right now it's irresponsible to comment one way or the other without actual documentation.
I'll comment. So the attacks took place on the 50th anniversary of the 1973 war, which is not trivial and not coincidental. And the 1973 war led to the fall of the Golda Meir government and the disgrace of a whole range of Israeli political leaders, including military leaders, because they ignored intelligence that was widely available to them in the period before, because they had a completely contemptuous and dismissive view of the military capabilities and the seriousness with which they had to take their, at that time, regional rivals, namely Syria under Hafez al-Assad and Egypt under Anwar Sadat. So this is an old story, and incompetence, hubris, arrogance, and contempt for people whose legitimate rights, political consciousness, existence you wish not to take seriously is an old story, and we've not seen the last of it, and this is only the latest example, I would say. So the disclosures are not surprising. It would have been surprising if they had been completely surprised, let us say. But it's also, you know, I mean, I think that, you know, the damage that the Israeli government can do to itself is also incalculable in the short run and long run. You know, I mean, we were talking about Netanyahu and his own political fortunes, and Ted made the very pithy and good point that, you know, he's concerned about his own staying out of jail and keeping his $30 million that he managed to steal. So, I mean, you know, let's not get, these people are not brilliant geniuses, even if they tell us they are. So.
Yes, I have a question for anyone on the panel who would like to answer it. To what extent is religion a factor in this conflict? And if it is a factor, how is it a factor?
I think it's a facet, but not the defining feature. And I think in my classes I talk about kind of a pendulum of you know, when there was the swing towards secular Arab nationalism under Nasser and the Ba'ath, et cetera, and because of their, you know, failure to liberate Palestine, the pendulum swung back towards political Islam in the 70s, 80s, and now. So, you know, when Hamas launched their attack, they weren't just talking about Palestinian self-determination or an end to the occupation. They were talking about Al-Aqsa and the desecration of the mosque and maybe the presence of police dogs at some point in there. So they are a nationalist religious movement, and you know, there are religious Zionists who see this conflict through a religious lens. That said, I don't think it's primarily a conflict about religion. And you know, roughly a third of the Israeli settlers in the West Bank are secular, who moved there for lower cost of housing. So that it's not so whereas the religious Zionists might be connected more to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, over Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel. This is, I think, primarily a conflict about nation belonging and security.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I pretty much agree with what Ted said there. And you know, as I was saying earlier, from the perspective of being a religious studies scholar, but also, you know, someone who draws heavily off of anarchist and Marxian political theorists, I generally feel that there's no such thing as purely religious conflicts. That all religious conflicts that we can point to throughout history had other socio-political and material conditions underlying them, meaning that there's geopolitical aims, there are you know, like say with the Crusades, like it would be easy to be like, oh, it was Christianity and Islam. That's as clear as it could be. No, there was also like that a lot of the various kings of Europe wanted these trade routes like secured throughout the Middle East and so forth. It was not something that is purely religious. What typically happens is that religion is added on after the fact as a way of legitimizing the situation. And quite often people in power will foment that on purpose in both directions. So, for example, you can see that there has been a rising sentiment on the one side, like on the Israeli side, there's an increasing desire to build the third temple. There's a increasing idea that Jewish state means a theocratic state amongst some of the far right. On the flip side, with Hamas, you have Islamist kind of organization that didn't exist before. Like Ted was saying, most of the resistance groups were secular a long time ago. And again, with Hamas, and this, you know, I said earlier, I like to be careful with what's documented, but this is all documented, easily well known. Like, Hamas was funded in its rise by both the Netanyahu government and with help of the U.S. intentionally to create a divide and conquer in the Palestinian movement. And so, yeah, I do believe in the end it's mainly about nations, it's about geopolitical goals, it's about the U.S. having a base of operations from which it can launch things. It's about a lot of things, but religion is not the main one.
I understand Donald Trump is not a very good Christian, but some people think he was sent to America by God, and he doesn't correct them. So I think that
he's also trying to stay out of jail. It seems there's a weird parallel with
Unless Ibrahim has something to say, we have one more question and we'll run out of time. And then I'll give the microphone to Eriq for closing remarks. Ibrahim, did you want to say anything?
We can't hear. You muted? I just wanted to comment on the, if anyone wants more information of David Kelly, because both of us were involved in the same testimony. I helped make a documentary with the British Member of Parliament, George Galloway. I just want to advertise it. It is Killing Kelly. And everything that you want to know about the possible, it's still to this day, the jury's out there, so to speak, in terms of the circumstances surrounding his death were very mysterious. So I do recommend this on behalf of George Galloway. I did help him film this. I was interviewed for the documentary, so that's just something again, not a lot of the synergies going on today in this panel. This is something I wanted to mention. And also, I had one more comment, again, just to bring this issue beyond the Middle East. The intelligence failure I saw that resonated was the one I was thinking of course, 1973 comes to mind, but I also like to remind people of the intelligence failure on the eve of the Tet Offensive. Nobody thought that, the Vietnamese farmers in their pajamas could have launched such a sophisticated operation throughout the breadth of Vietnam, reaching, the doorsteps of the American embassy. So that is kind of in a broader perspective, and kind of, again, in terms of, military superior power and their hubris, and then just taken by shock. That's what reminded me October 7th was the intelligence failure on the eve of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam.
Coming at this late hour, I'm not going to ask a question because I consider these teach-ins as a continuing conversation and learning process. And even though I've been involved in this, coming from Turkey for a very long time, I've learned a lot. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your contributions. And more importantly, for providing a global as well as a historical context to what's happening today. Because when the Secretary General said October 7th did not occur in a vacuum, he got into real trouble because people don't want to understand the context. And it's really important, especially for the younger generation, before they become advocates and activists, to learn the history of this conflict, because it's going to be with us for a long time. So thank you for the organizers and for the speakers. And in preparation for our next event on the 7th of December, some of you might want to take a look at an article that came out in the Haaretz yesterday, which is called One State, Two State, or a Confederal State. I think it would be really interesting to bring it into the conversation. Thank you again.
So before I turn the microphone back to Eriq, I just want to say two things. First is to thank each and every one of the panelists for their insights, for their thoughtfulness, and the generosity of spirit that brings them here to share that knowledge, to share their thoughts with our community. And I'm really grateful for that. And I also really want to thank Eriq for agreeing to be here and participate in this conversation and guide this conversation. Thank you so much. And finally, just one more little thing before we end it. Our music department has so generously brought wonderful homemade cookies by the mother of one of our Assyrian Iraqi students, and they will be outside because we can't eat in here. So right after we're done, come out for cookies, please.
Thank you, John. I don't want to keep you guys for too much longer, so I'll make this very brief. Again, I want to echo everyone's thanks and gratitude. I want to thank you all for your insight and knowledge that you provide for us. If we could just give them one more round of applause. So just to reiterate, the next event is on Thursday, December 7th at 6 p.m. here in the same location, Warren Auditorium. To stay up to date with news and community events here at USD and around San Diego, I implore you all to follow the Instagram of the Palestine Solidarity Committee, which is at PSC USD. It will be the best place to know when events will be organized for the spring semester coming up in 2024. I want to give a special shout out once again to the Student and Faculty Organizing Committee, but especially a special shout out to John Halak. Meditations on Presence and Absence in Native Lands. It's absolutely incredible and powerful exhibit, so you should all definitely go to see it. And if you're a student and you bring your student ID, you get free admission. So that will be there. It's on the second floor of the museum, and it's until February 18th, so you have some time. Lastly, it is so important to show up to these events, so thank you all for attending and giving your full attention to the panelists tonight. Make sure your efforts don't stop here, though. I urge you all to continue learning, keep coming to various events at USD and within the San Diego community, and bring a friend or maybe 4 next time, just to make sure that as many people are learning as possible. Pressure your representatives, keep talking about it, keep posting, keep sharing. It is important momentum isn't lost and that we don't get used to what is happening right now in Gaza. If you are a USD student, faculty, or staff, I also implore you to sign on to the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction petition that is requesting institutional change here at USD. You can learn more about that at tinyurl.com/BDSUSD. Again, it's tinyurl.com/BDSUSD. Your individual contribution can make such a huge difference, so don't underestimate your power. Thank you all once again. And I hope you all